Good afternoon. I would like, in my name and in the name of the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation, to welcome you all. Also would like to thank Professor Grayson Norquist for giving us his talk today and to welcome him in Portugal. And for the foundation, it is a great pleasure to have this kind of initiative here. We always foster the health science research and innovation, and for us it's a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon to everybody. First of all, thank you, Professor Sergio Gulbenkian, for once more having offered the opportunity to organize a scientific event at the Gulbenkian Foundation headquarters. I also want to thank Professor Grayson Norquist for having accepted the invitation to come to Lisbon and to give a conference on outcomes research and the lessons that we can take from the PCORI experience in the United States. I want also to thank the three discussants, Professor Vaz Carneiro, Professor Altamiro da Costa, Professor Pedro Pita Barros, and all of you who accept the challenge to come here to discuss this theme. As you know, over the past 20 years, our scientific capacity in health sciences has increased in an extraordinary manner in Portugal. We could say that health sciences was for sure one of the areas in which our country most progressed in the recent years. The increase in the number of publications, not only in absolute terms, but also in terms of the impact factor was amazing. Is the area in Portugal that has increased more in the last few years. Thanks to this progress, we have nowadays in Portugal a significant number of centers and of research groups which are very well connected with the international networks and which are producing very good research. This progress, however, we have to say, has especially occurred in basic sciences. This is the area in which the spectacular progress took place, and maybe with the political measures that were recently taken by the government, we will be able to expect a similar development in clinical research. We already have good people doing quite good clinical research, but not with the same development that we could see in basic sciences. And on the areas of health services research, unfortunately, the situation is completely different. We could even say that health services research has been generally forgotten and undervalued in Portugal. Usually, research funds are not available for this kind of research. And I'm afraid I'm not exaggerating if I say that many people, even in the health science area, remain unfamiliar with health services research and with outcomes research and in what distinguishes these areas of research from other areas of health research. This is completely unacceptable and strange in a country which is confronted with deep concerns about the cost of health care, with the quality of medical care, and which is involved in public health efforts and health reforms. Portugal, as all other countries, needs more information about comparative effectiveness of treatment and interventions, the value of the different clinical strategies, and also how we can value innovative approaches. In this context, we increasingly need studies that can help us to take the right decisions, whether we are policymakers or we are clinicians or we are patients. So this is the reason why the Lisbon Society of Medical Sciences decided to organize this session on outcomes research, and especially taking advantage of the possibility of having Professor Norquist, who is in a very good position to talk to us about an initiative in the US that I'm sure, can give us important lessons for us to develop in the future. This is not the first time that the Lisbon Society of Medical Sciences tries to give a contribution to the development of health sciences. Maybe some of you don't know, but this society is one of the oldest medical societies. It was created in 1822, so it has almost 200 years. It's an old society. I have to say that there were times when this society was much more active than it is nowadays. Anyway, the society has an important role in promoting and being the base of the most prestigious awards in health sciences in Portugal. And we have organized a couple of sessions that had some impact. 2 years ago, one on how medical schools can coordinate efforts with hospitals and other health institutions, that really launched the debate in Portugal about the academic medical centers, that had not all the impact we were expecting, but nevertheless launched this debate, and I'm sure that some results will come up in the near future. The other discussion that the society launched was on how the government could launch policies that could help clinical research to develop. And in December, finally, the government took some measures that I believe received some inspiration from that debate. So I hope that this session and this discussion on outcomes research will be also able to, first, to launch a debate on this area of research. Secondly, to strengthen cooperation between the people who are already involved in services and outcomes research in Portugal, and most of them are here. Unfortunately, there are not many more than the ones we can see here, but here are the good ones, the best ones, so this is the good start. If this session only can give some contribution to strengthen the collaboration and to make the policymakers aware of the importance of this kind of research, we will be already very happy. Unfortunately, we had until yesterday the promise of the Secretary of State that she would be here, and that was for me very important because she would have the opportunity to learn also. And I have to tell you that she is really very much interested in having more information about the importance of outcome research and about what can be done to strengthen this kind of research in Portugal. Unfortunately, the session on the ceremony on the nomination of the new president of FCT I will explain later on what is FCT, that was planned for tomorrow had to be anticipated to today. You know, these politicians are all the time with very difficult agendas, changing their agenda. So Professor Leonor Pereira will be not able to be here. She's at this moment in that session. But we will send to her all the slides and all the information about what will be said here today. As you know, we will have a conference by Professor Grayson Norquist. He's the chairperson of the Board of Governors of the PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute. I'm not going to say anything about that because for the next 30 or 40 minutes you will hear many things about this amazing institute. And it's really a very, very interesting experience that is being developed in the United States, which I hope will give us good ideas that will be useful for us. Professor Norquist has a long, long career. I'm not going to tell everything, just tell you that he's currently the vice chair of the Emory University Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. Before joining Emory, he was the chair of the psychiatric department at the University of Mississippi School of Medicine. And for many years, maybe almost 20 years, he served at the National Institute of Mental Health, where he had a very important role and intervention. I met him when I was in Washington 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and at that time he was the director of the Division of Services and Intervention Research, the division that was responsible for clinical prevention and services research at the NIMH. And he really had a very, very important role in the supporting mental health services research. And also he gave a very important contribution to international, global initiatives at that time, trying to also benefiting young people and researchers from other countries in terms of be trained and connected to the US networks. He has a lot of important research, especially on mental health services research, on primary care mental health services, and in other areas related with the quality evaluation, quality measures of mental health care. So I'm very pleased to give the floor to Professor. Yeah, sure.
So thank you very much. I apologize. I do not speak Portuguese, so you have to listen to me in English. It's very typical of people in the United States. We don't know many languages. Je parle un peu français. That's about as far as I go. So bear with me. And I also apologize. There is at least one person from the U.S. who can bear this out. Some of the younger people I met this morning from the wonderful master's course that you have here. In the U.S., we tend to like to move around. I don't know what that is. So if I start to drift, you may have to push me back because the microphone will not follow me. You don't have a lavalier. We usually have these lavalier microphones so we can perform on the stage. But I do want to thank Professor Caldas de Almeida. He's very modest. I mean, when I knew him at the Institute, he did some absolutely fabulous stuff for PAHO and was a big thinker in policy. And I think being back here today makes me miss those wonderful conversations I had with him and some wonderful things that he's done. This master's level program that you're doing here is really quite fantastic. And I thank the Gulbenkians also for putting this on. This is in your society. I wish we had a 200-and-something-year-old society that was still staying together. Most of ours kind of give up after about 50 years. So I can always come back and talk to your secretary. I love to come to Portugal. I've been here before, so if you want me to come back and talk, just have her come back, ask me back, or she can come to Washington. So listening to Professor Caldas de Almeida talk about the problems with clinical research and services and and your politicians, it sounds like I'm at home. It's the same in the U.S., so you're not much different than we are. That's the interesting thing about the globe now, is that we're very similar. So what I'm going to tell you about is this Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute that the U.S. government formed, and fortunately did not form as a U.S. federal agency. It is an independent agency. So our president, we like to think we know a lot of things in the U.S. Very few things do we really know, but we like to think that often. But in this case, they got something right. And 5 years ago, finally, if you can believe this, in the United States, we had what's called national health care reform, and we put into place a bill that they are still fighting over, if you can believe this, to try to insure everyone. If you can believe that, in our country, people are not insured for health care. And as a part of that, this institute was formed. And the idea was that what people were struggling with in the United States, by the way, I'm a practicing psychiatrist as well. I do a lot of other things. I have many other jobs that he did not mention, and I'm the chair of the Board of Governors for this, but I actually am a practicing psychiatrist, and I'm a geriatric psychiatrist, and I see patients, and I'm also, the other thing that I do is I'm the chief of the psychiatry service for the largest urban hospital in Atlanta. That's where I live now with Emory University, and so I oversee that large. We have over 800 visits a month in our emergency room, and we have a large number of patients that we see. So I see patients every day myself, and so one of the things that I've always struggled with is the person sitting in front of me, what do I do? So we like to believe we have all the evidence in the world about what to do, but the reality is most of the time what we decide to do is a flip of the coin. That's the kind of evidence that we have. And the interesting thing about the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute is we do all of health, so it's not just mental health. And the shocking thing, now I started out in internal medicine and then I moved over into psychiatry. And I like to believe as an internist I knew exactly what to do, but the reality is in medicine we do not have a lot of evidence for the things that we do. So think about that when you're a patient and you walk in. So I'm a clinician, but sometimes I'm a patient, right? So for medical stuff, and I go in and I want to believe that the internist that I see knows exactly what to do, and we get in these arguments. I say, well, what evidence do you have for that? Why should I do that? But that's what we struggle with in the United States is how do we get that evidence? That's the reason the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute was formed, is because our large healthcare research organization, the National Institutes of Health, has over $8 billion a year and has not done a very good job at really coming up with the evidence, we would argue. A lot of very good basic research, searches for the cures, these kind of things, but that's wonderful. I'm not against basic research. I think that's very important. But today as a patient and today as a clinician, I need information that I can use to make a decision about what's going to give me the best outcome for the person who's sitting in front of me. As policymakers in the United States and elsewhere, you want to know where to put your funds for the best bang for the buck, so to speak, to improve the health of the population. So that's why this was formed. All right. So we're an independent research agency. There's a big political fight about this. The NIH and another agency that we have called the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality fought among themselves to try to get this. And the solution was don't give it to either one of them. Make it independent. But it's a very good reason it's independent, because then we don't have the bureaucracy of the federal government that we had. I worked, as Dr. Caldas de Almeida told you, I worked for 15 years, not 20 years. I don't want to make myself feel too old. 15 years at the National Institute of Mental Health. And it's not easy to get grants out, to fund them, to make sure. It takes a while. You have to go through several. We are much more nimble in a way in doing that, and we don't have some of the political issues that NIH actually has. They like to believe, if you hear Francis Collins, who's the director of NIH, is on our board of governors. And so Francis and I talk about this, and Francis likes to talk about how it's all pure, without any politics. Oh, there's politics everywhere in the NIH, I can assure you. I was part of it. So we're independent. We're a 21 board member. That 21 members is made up of incredibly diverse people. We have clinicians like myself. We have patients on the board. We have representatives from pharma, from Pfizer. We have people from Johnson & Johnson. We have device manufacturers, Medtronic, which I think they're now something else. They would just merge with an Irish company or something, which is for financial reasons. And we have people from health industry, from funders, health insurers, from state governments, and as I said, patients. So we have a wide variety of people on our board. Why? Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that what we do is relevant to the end users of the healthcare research. Because one of the problems we've had is that sometimes the research, particularly the clinical research we do, the answers we come up with are not what patients want to know. They want to know about something else. Okay, and I'll give you some examples of that in a minute. So we fund what we call comparative clinical effectiveness research, and what that means is comparison of different interventions. So it can be preventive interventions, clinical interventions, system-level interventions. But what we're trying to do is compare one against another to see whether one or two or three is better than another one. We seek to answer real-world questions. Not that any of the science questions we have are not real-world, but we're really focused on how these things work among large, diverse populations in practical settings. How do we get our money? I mean, we don't just do this for free. So where do we get our money? So the way we get our money is we get $150 million every year as a direct transfer from the U.S. Treasury. And then in order to have prevented us, this is a very smart little move that some of the congressional people did, in order to prevent us from having the Congress cut that off, because one of the things in our federal government is they allocate money, they can always not allocate it. They can just take it away. So the way they got around that is they put a $2 tax on every insurance premium in the United States. So we get $2 of every insurance premium, and that mounts up to about $600 million a year in new funds that we get to do just this research. Okay. That at first did not go over well with the insurance industry. They saw that as a tax on them. They didn't like that, all this stuff. We got around that when we pointed out $2 on a $1,000 premium. Come on, that's not a big deal. So, okay, why was it needed? I talked about this. For all the advances that we have, the traditional healthcare research has not answered many of the questions that we face today. Okay, it's pretty clear. We would like to believe that, but they don't. People want to know which preventive diagnostic or treatment option is best for them. So when they sit there, which one really? What does the research tell me about what I should do for my problems with my comorbid issues? And patients and their clinicians, like me, need the information they can understand and use. It's got to be something that's useful. So when I was at the National Institute of Mental Health, I actually launched a number of these. This is why I'm on this board, because I started some of this 20 years ago in mental health. So for those of you who are in mental health, you know about the CATIE trial, which was comparing antipsychotics. We also had a bipolar trial comparing interventions, and we launched all those back then. Because, for example, in the CATIE trial that was comparing all the different antipsychotics against each other, the largest study that had ever been done in schizophrenia before that was about 300 people. And so when you take a population that's as small as that, it's not a very diverse population. And what kind of conclusions can you draw from such a small population with not very diverse population with comorbid problems? And how does that apply to the patient who sits in front of you who may have a comorbid substance abuse problem, 2 or 3 other medical problems? So we launched CATIE to compare all of these different drugs, and we did it across 4,000 people so that we could get a better signal on more homogeneous groups within that. So our mission is to help people make informed healthcare decisions and improve the healthcare delivery and outcomes by producing and promoting, of course, high integrity. We want our studies to be methodologically very sound, evidence-based information that comes from research guided. Now notice this is what's different. It's guided by patients, caregivers, and the broader healthcare community. It's not coming down from on high from the clinical researcher. It's being done together with the end user from the beginning. Okay? So we have 3 main goals. It's very easy. We want to increase the quantity, the quality, and the timeliness of our information. So we want to do these studies and come up with the evidence. Once we have the evidence, we want to speed the implementation. For those of you who don't know, there's research to show that when you find a new intervention, it takes 17 years to actually get it into practice, roughly. It may take actually longer than that. So one of the core things that we're very interested in is how can you change system and provider behavior to ensure that what we think is the right thing to do is done. Because the reality is, if you look in the world out there, we come up with great interventions and they are not actually utilized correctly out there in the real world. So that's why we don't get such great outcomes when we put many of our new drugs and other interventions out into the real world. And then finally, We want to influence the way research is done by others. We want to fundamentally change this kind of way in which research, so that everyone does it this way. So it's not by mistake that Francis Collins sits on our board, and also Rick Cronick, who is head of the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, is also on our board, because the idea was to put them on our board to influence what they do in their large agencies. So our hope is that we will fundamentally change the way in which outcomes research is done in the future. So you find somebody that's not a stakeholder, that's not one of our stakeholders, let me know, because I've done something wrong. They should be on this list. So these are who our stakeholders are. And we go to all of these. We engage every single one of these groups. We have advisory committees that are made up of these groups. The way we pick the topics is we go to them and ask them what do they think are the leading health problems. Not what I may think, but what do they think are the big leading health problems. This is what I just said. We have a variety of different programs, advisory groups, speakers bureaus, webinars. We do these engagement awards, which I'll tell you about. We actually give money for these. We have what we call PCORI ambassadors who go around the country and talk about what we're doing and engage other people. And we have these pipeline I'll tell you about. And on our merit reviews, when we review our grants, we have patients and other stakeholders that are part of that review process, not just researchers, okay? So I've already said that this is the kind of research that we fund. It measures benefits in real-world populations and informs very specific clinical or policy decisions, okay? Now, what's important about this is that comparative effectiveness research uses very large populations. And one of the problems with traditional clinical research is on very select populations. So one of the problems is that you have is kind of an average effect. And so when you get a result, it's kind of an average effect. That's why it's not very applicable to the people that you see every day with a variety of problems. And so one of the big points about having very large groups is that you can start to narrow down into much more homogeneous groups who's more likely to be have a better outcome with an intervention. And what I point out to Francis and other basic researchers is that the beauty of that is that when you see subgroups who are not responding to an intervention, what is it that's different about those people? And that can inform the basic research people to go back and say, what are the unique qualities about these people? And maybe we should look in a different way about designing a new intervention. So in some ways, it's this feedback loop that also helps to improve the development of new interventions. Okay, it's what we say it's a relatively new form because it considers patients' needs and preferences and the outcomes that are most important to them. So I always give this example. There are two examples that I use. One is in mental health, is about if you have somebody with schizophrenia, and for those of you who know, the traditional kind of positive symptoms are what we think about in schizophrenia with hallucinations and paranoid ideation and these kind of things. If you talk to a patient, though, they don't care whether every single hallucination is wiped out. Now, as a clinician, you often think, well, I've got to get every single one of those hallucinations to stop or I failed in some way. But what patients really want is a life. So if you can give them a house, you can give them a good place to live, they can function enough that they can get a job, that's good enough. Because I could get rid of as I've told people in kind of semi-joking way, you can get rid of hallucinations by putting everybody under general anesthesia, but nobody wants to live their life under general anesthesia, right? It's not. We often come close to that by giving patients many, many drugs till we get almost every one of those. And when you see those patients and how pitiful they look and the medical problems they have, that's not a life that they want. Okay, and so we drive our clinical research questions by what the end user wants. And I can tell you across like that, if you look in urology, and since I'm getting old as a man, one of the big issues is in prostate cancer, right? And so there's an obvious intervention for prostate cancer. Just rip it all out, tear everything out, get every last little bit of it. What are you left with? You're left with some horrible functioning problems. You may not be able to urinate. You have all these other kind of issues. Most men don't want to end up that way. So is there some other intervention that can meet you halfway as to what someone wants? That's the kind of thing that's driving the questions that we're trying to answer. I often use that one in front of the congressman because at least that gets their attention when they think, oh, wait, that could be me, so maybe I better pay some money for this. Okay. And the key thing is we also consider the circumstances. So the system and what is the impact on the system. Okay. Oh, I shouldn't have done that. I pushed the wrong button. Okay. Now, we have a variety of ways. I want to tell you about how we fund this. So we have this great idea, but how do we get to our endpoint? You know, we actually evaluate ourselves. So it's great to have these wonderful ideas, but how do we get there? So one way we do it is we have 5 general program areas, which is it's kind of like an NIH approach that we call let the flowers bloom. So sometimes you go out and you say, we have a very specific question we want somebody to answer, like we did with Katie, and we have some of those. Another approach is to say, let's see what the field out there thinks. Let's let them come in and tell us what their best ideas are, okay? So this is our component of that approach, which is that we have 5 programs. And one program is assessment of prevention, diagnosis, and treatment options. So we have a general funding announcement, and we let people come in for their best ideas about how to approach this, right? So these are comparative effectiveness, safety, alternative, prevention, diagnostic options to determine which ones are best. So you can submit a grant with a particular idea. It doesn't make any difference what in medicine. Another one is improving healthcare systems, because we all know that these interventions don't just operate in a vacuum. They are affected by the system around them. And so we also have a general program in how making different approaches in a system-level intervention can impact the health outcomes of people, okay? Communication and dissemination. So the key issue here in dissemination research is, put a slash there for implementation research, is how do we get people to use what we think is the best thing to use. But the other part of the communication is how do you communicate at the patient-clinician level. There's a lot of information we have, and often you go into a physician, I've watched this because I've helped patients go in and try to talk to their clinicians, and they go in and they come out and they have no clue what the clinician said to them. Not a clue. And you ask the doctor what they said, and they say, well, I told him, I tell you, it's like the patient didn't hear one word of that, didn't have a clue what they said. And even when you, as we say, dumb it down to the 2nd grade level or something, it still doesn't. They still don't understand. Why? Because we're not conveying information in a way that people understand it. And so these clinical decision tools are something else that we're putting money into, is how do you help people understand the information that's being provided to them, okay? And then addressing disparities. We're very key on trying to understand. We all know that there are differences in the way people respond. And sometimes it's due to social determinants, it's due to racial issues, it's due to other kind of issues. And so we have a particular focus on understanding the disparities in health. That sometimes are due to income level and other kinds of issues like that. So we have a program in that. And finally, the 5th area is improving the actual methods of how we do this. Because none of this means anything unless it's valid. Why is it doing that? That shouldn't have happened. Okay, I think I've really messed up now. 1 second while I fix the, oh good, the IT guy is coming down here. So while he's doing that, I think I must have touched this button, which I wasn't supposed to. They don't have like a little thing that says do not touch this button. So what I wanted to say about the methodology thing is that really has been a very important area, and we have a very large committee that, the next slide, that was the next one. We got to go back. There we go, perfect. Okay, so the NIH has not done much of this, and we have a very large national committee for methods research, and we have a wonderful report on our website, so I'm not going to go into that. You can look at that. But we're fundamentally trying to change. That's a part of how we're changing how research is done. Okay. So these are the criteria that we meet. So we get research grants, and we want to make sure that, number one, they have some impact on the health of individuals and populations. That the potential for the study to improve health care and outcomes. These are the major criteria we use to judge whether something should be funded. Third is technical merit. So we do consider technical merit because it's pointless to have a study at the end of which the results we will all argue about. Patient-centeredness and patient and stakeholder engagement. We actually require in our grants that the researchers have a partnership with patients and other stakeholders that are relevant, and if it's not there, they're not funded. And we expect those people to also have some part of the funding. I'm going to skip over this. I've already talked about this. So we fund research that focuses on high-priority conditions. I love these little... This is supposed to represent at the top neuroscience, of course, the brain, right? But it's mental health is what we talk about. So what we look at are high priority conditions, those that are affecting large numbers of people across a range of the population, heavy burden on individuals and families, and including we are mandated by the Congress to study rare diseases, so we do that as well. And we also focus on these issues, as I've said, about making sure that they focus on low-income groups, racial and ethnic minority groups, residents of, because these are the traditional groups that have poor outcomes, okay, and that's where the health disparities issue comes in. So let me give you some examples of some of the ones that have come out of all this. So one is we have a big project on treatment options in uterine fibroids. You would be amazed. A large number of women have this as a problem, and probably there's some women in this room who we won't ask them this question, but uterine fibroids are a major issue for bleeding and for pain and a variety of other things. Interestingly enough, the evidence for those options of what to do is not very good. And this was one of the highlighted questions that came out of some of the priority groups that we had, and it came up as a top topic. The effectiveness of transitional care when people are moving from an acute situation to something else. Treatment options for African Americans and Hispanic and Latinos in the U.S. with uncontrolled asthma. They have horrible outcomes, and the evidence about what to do for them is just not clear at all. And obviously obesity is a major problem in our country, and particularly among underserved and poor populations. And the NIH has done very little on this, but it is a major public health question. And then clinical interventions to address hypertension disparities, and we'll talk a little bit, falls in elderly people. As a geriatric psychiatrist, this is a huge issue. My father, who's 94, just fell and broke his hip like 3 months ago, and we spent 2 months getting him out of the hospital. So this is a major issue. That fall never happened. So we've already talked about this. We're trying to improve the methodology. I'm going to skip over that. We support researchers nationwide except the state I used to live in for a while, which was down here. I live over here now in Atlanta. So in general, we're trying to fund all across the United States, even Alaska and Hawaii, which I was joking with the folks today. For those of you who don't know U.S. geography, Alaska is not an island. It does not sit down there. That's actually on top of Mexico. It should be up there attached to Canada, but anyway. So, nobody would be surprised at the top conditions. And look what's over there, mental health, right? These are the ones that came in. Remember that I told you the flowers that bloom? We asked people what were the big questions, what came in. These are the major ones. Cancer, no surprise, right? We always hear about cancer. Cardiovascular disease, but mental health is up there in the top 3. That's not a surprise to any of us in mental health. It's always amazing to me how it keeps surprising the other people in medicine who always keep being surprised. But now when you go around the U.S., it is a major issue. Everybody is talking about what to do about mental health issues. Okay, so I'm not going to go through each program. This was just to let you know about some of the examples of the kinds of things that we are funding. We're particularly, this was a useful study that we just got the results on that was looking at comparing the effectiveness of oral versus intravenous administration of antibiotics in children who require at home. And so what has been going on is that in the United States they use IV antibiotics. It was thought to be the evidence. And basically the outcome of the study shows that it's no better than oral antibiotics. What a huge difference that makes, right? You don't have to have your poor child at home sitting around with an IV antibiotic and, you know, tethered to this pole with something. Now you can give them oral antibiotics and get the same outcome. So that's a classic example of where we've been able to change practice, but also make a difference in the lives of these kids. Okay. I'm going to move through these because this would take too much time, actually. I didn't realize I'd put all these slides in, but this was each program. I'll make sure I leave the slides if you're interested in the kinds of things. I think this is a good one that Ken Wells is doing in Los Angeles. What he has done is the traditional way of trying to improve public health is to give these technical advices to people. Go into a health center and tell them, you know, these are the kind of things to do. What Ken has done is that in Los Angeles, he actually went out and engaged the community. He actually sat down with the community and said, what do you need? What are the kind of things that you think would make a difference in your community? I the reason I was in Mississippi is I'm originally from there, and I went back to do this kind of work there in the rural Delta of Mississippi, where the blues were born. For those of you who are very interested, very similar to Fado, but it's our version of Fado. But the blues grew up there, but in a hardship area. I mean, it's a very poor area. And so I started to do this there and work with people there and build interventions from the ground floor up, working with that. And that's what Ken has done in LA. And so what they found in Los Angeles is that working with the community, developing an intervention from the ground floor up with the community, they've actually had a wonderful impact on prevention of depression in that community and actually decreasing the time course of depression by using a community-based intervention. You can read his papers and he'll give you the detail on what they're doing, but this is some of the research that we've also funded. Okay. Now, I told you that we have this very broad announcement kind of area. Then we also have very specific questions, and that's our large pragmatic clinical studies. So the idea being that now what we're doing is we're saying, what are these big questions? And we're going to put, $90 million into a project, and we want to know the answer to that project. And so we're going to put that out. And so we have some questions. One that we've just launched, by the way, which is a big issue right now, is hepatitis C. And the comparison of these interventions in hepatitis C, they're quite expensive. And I know you were just telling me that you decided to pay for these. It's still a big argument in the United States about who should get it, when should they get these interventions. And quite honestly, what we don't know is what is the long-term effect of these interventions. The drug companies have actually put these out, but we do not know if 10 years from now, what we'll be faced with after the use of these interventions. So that's where we're going with this. This was quite controversial, I will tell you, when we decided to take this on. Some pushback. One of the drug companies had a big fit we were going to go into this, but we kind of said we're going, and that was a good thing about being an independent agency. Quite honestly, I think NIH would not have been able to do it the way it needed to be done. And this is about, we select particular research areas. Here are some examples: surgical options for hip fracture, treatment strategies for autism spectrum disorder. What we do in autism, I don't know what we're doing half the time. I'm a geriatric person, but I still see this with my child people. Treatment options for multiple sclerosis. These are big issues. Cardiovascular disease in underserved populations. So here are some of the questions. Does cancer screening, for example, tailored to individual risk and preferences, detect breast cancer and minimize screening-related harms as well as or more effectively than annual screening? So, we do a lot of mammographies, we do a lot of CT scans and stuff. That's radiation, folks. And if you keep getting a lot of that, that's not good for you, perhaps, in the long term. And so we're trying to figure out, even for things like screening, what are the best intervals to do this, what kinds of screening. It's the same issue with, we'll go back to the thing for guys on prostate, the specific antigen. How useful is that test, and how good is it at predicting an issue? Again, these are some other examples. I'm not going to read through these. You can see the slides, but these are an example of the kind of things that you can see are kind of everyday questions that people struggle with all the time, and about what are the answers. Now, here's the other big thing that we've gotten into. So what we really want to do is this idea of changing the way research is being done, and this is the infrastructure issue. Because doing clinical trials and doing this kind of research is very expensive, and one of the problems you do is that you set up a big network of patients in a given area, you do the research, and then you tear it all down, you go away. So what we're trying to do is make this a permanent kind of platform and also make it more efficient. So what we've done through this PCORI net, and we put now almost $300 million into this as an infrastructure platform. And what we do is we have two components of this, and I don't know if it's going to be on the next slide, so let me tell you right now. We have what are basically our CDRNs, and what they are a compilation of very large health systems data. So we have these electronic health records in the United States, and what we're trying to do now is to start to put these together with common data standards. Now that's where the big rub is right now, is trying to develop these common data standards. But you can imagine putting all of these data elements together, you have huge numbers of people that you can follow over a period of time to see what the outcome is and what happens to them. And You can even insert a particular study. So one of the things we're looking at is the use of aspirin as a preventive measure in cardiovascular disease. Because we have this assumption that you just take an aspirin. We don't know how much to take. We don't know who to do it in, these kind of things. The other component of the PCORI net is what we call patient-powered research networks. And what those are is we match a group of researchers with patients who have a particular disease. So in mental health, there's a patient-powered research network in bipolar disorder. And a researcher at Harvard has matched up with a large group of people who have bipolar disorder, particularly their organization of patients. And so now you have this platform on which a study in bipolar disorder can be done, and it's ready to go because you have willing and able participants who are patients along with the researchers. So we have the pharmaceutical industry. We just met with a large number of representatives from them, the device met. They're all incredibly interested in being a part of this. So what we're trying to do is develop the platform and have it sustained by research studies from a variety of different groups, including the NIH, who will use it as a platform. There's a great deal of interest in this in the United States, and I've been going up to our Congress and talking to some of them, and they're very interested in seeing how this will go. Here it is. So we have 11 clinical data research networks that are working together, these 18 patient-powered research networks, and then, of course, we have a funded coordinating center that coordinates all these folks. So the other thing that we do is we give money to actually pay for researchers to engage patients. Because one of the things that we found when we first started with this is the researchers would come to me and they would say, oh, it's so hard to talk to patients. I mean, you was like, what? Or how to engage them in research. And so what we're doing is actually forming these partnerships by putting money in and having actual partnerships develop between patients and researchers. And as I said, our stakeholders, including patients, are involved in all of the aspects of what we do: topic selection, proposal review, in the implementation, and also in the evaluation. We have on our website, you might find interesting, we actually developed an engagement rubric. How do you engage people, if you can imagine? So we had to come up with this to try to explain, and it's up on our website. So we spent a lot of effort on that and trying to, it's a nice little wonderful diagram and some other issues about how do you actually work with patients and others to engage them. We have these engagement awards. This is where they are in the United States. Eugene Washington was the first chair of our board and had to step aside because he had just become the vice chancellor at the UCLA School of Medicine, and that was just too much work. I'm going to skip over this. Who can apply? Anyone? And usually I put this in here because usually if I go somewhere outside the U.S., people always say, can I apply? Yes. And then there always is the little warning thing, which is as long as it applies to the population in the United States. But of course it does. I mean, in this kind of work, it usually does. So we're always looking for global partners. This is just a merit. So I did want to say again that implementation is an incredibly important area, and we're putting money into this. We're doing it, by the way, as an interface with the Agency for Research on Healthcare and Quality, because that's their primary focus now. That's all they do is implementation research. I'm going to skip over this. We have this framework now, which is on our website, about how to do this kind of work in dissemination implementation, if you're interested in that. So we've spent a lot of money over the last year actually coming up with the way to do this. We want to know whether we make any difference, and so we have a big evaluation of ourselves, basically. Does this really make any difference? What are the effects of this? And so we have a number of ways in which we're approaching this. We have a strategic plan. We have goals that we have to meet. We have these dashboards that have either green or red lights, whether we're meeting them, and we have a variety of ways in which we assess what we're doing. This is what I said at the beginning, and I hope I've convinced you of this, is that everything that we know already, we have not answered many of the questions that we all face. People want to know which treatment is best for them, and patients and clinicians need the information to make a better decision. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to change who's on the research team, right, just not standard academic researchers, the kinds of questions being asked, the speed of the implementation of that evidence, and the role of a researcher from a solo specialist to a team member. So that, in a nutshell, is really kind of what we're trying to do at PCORI, and I hope you see that as something that we all think is very interesting. It's gotten a lot of interest in. We did start off, I will tell you this, there is one thing, I didn't say anything at all, and I don't know if any of you picked this up, about cost. We do not do cost effectiveness research. Why? Because it was a major political issue. And thanks to the Republicans on our side, they actually mandated that we may not do anything on cost. Why? Because the fear was, if you can believe this in the United States, the fear was that we would attach cost to this, and at the end of the day we would say, aha, this costs too much, and so therefore you cannot get it. And so we were labeled as a death panel, that somehow we would come out with these things and say and pronounce that this is not cost effective and therefore should not be done, and we would just let people die because we wouldn't do it. In the United States, that is a big no-no. You do not say that you cannot have what you want, regardless of how much it costs, even though, of course, we deal with this all the time, but not to certain political parties. So I don't know if I'll be allowed to go back in the country now, but anyway, so that's the reason we don't talk about costs. So we, as they say, we just give the facts, and somebody else gets to take the facts and decide how to implement those facts, depending on the cost, okay? Now, there are a couple other things I thought I'd bring you up completely up to date about what's happening also in the United States related around outcomes research. And there's several things that are happening. One is this Choosing Wisely program. And what that's about is that we do a lot of things already, and we've kind of got them in, and we never go back and we say, you know, should we keep doing that? Why do we keep doing this, you know? And so what Choosing Wisely is turning it around and thinking, let's go back and look at some of the things that we've been doing and see whether we should still do them. And so in mental health, the American Psychiatric Association, I'm on their board, I'm on too many boards, but I'm on the board of their foundation, and I'm about to become the chair of the Council on Quality. And so one of the things that we looked at is, what would you pick in mental health? One of the biggest problems we've got in mental health is the overuse of antipsychotics. It's amazing how many people are on more than 2 antipsychotics with absolutely no evidence in anything that we have that makes a difference. And so now we have this pronouncement that you shouldn't do that without some high level of evidence that you can purport for the patient that you're doing it with. And there's a wide use of antipsychotics simply for insomnia, if you can believe that the pharmaceutical firm who made quetiapine, Seroquel in the United States, has pushed this in such a big way, it is widely used for this, with absolutely no good evidence that it is good for that particular condition. Now, the other thing, there are these other 2 things that the Congress is pushing now. One is precision medicine, and the other one is 21st century cures. And no offense to the geneticists in the room, but that's all about genetics, right? Because the idea is we're going to find the gene, and therefore we're going to be able to predict the response of a treatment. We will find new treatments, and we will find the cure. Well, most of you don't know this, but we had an infamous president, which I said today, Richard Nixon, who promised that by the year 2000 we would cure cancer. Well, that went quickly, right? Like a lot of other things Nixon said. But what has happened is that most people recognize it's too linear, it's not the way it's going to work. And as Professor Gulbenkian and I were talking about earlier, since he's a neuropeptide researcher, we all know actually it's the neuropeptides actually after they're coded makes the big difference. So why am I talking about this? Because outcomes research has an impact on this. So you can come up with all the best ideas about a new intervention, but you've got to test whether they're really going to work in wide populations. And every genetic researcher will tell you, you need huge populations to really start to be able to see a signal about an effect and whether a gene is going to have. And in our conditions in mental health, they are so complex, and most of our patients are not really homogeneous, that it is impossible that we're ever going to find a single gene, if we ever believe that in the first place, and even a combination of genes to make a difference. And as I said earlier, that outcomes research like this, when you have large populations who don't respond and you have subgroups, it is a signal, I would argue, back to the basic research, is to go back to the drawing board and think about what might be the way to approach it. Okay. So, the idea is that precision medicine, with genotyping, you can determine the need for treatment, select a targeted therapy to avoid major adverse effects or to determine drug uses. However, using multiple prediction algorithms with or without genetic information to predict risk of an adverse outcome or to predict response to treatment, you need to use these multiple algorithms. You can't just, knowing a gene is not going to help you predict. And to segment clinical populations, the idea of precision medicine is to segment clinical populations on the basis of a prediction algorithm scores. But this is really going to come from much larger studies, right? And with clinical data attached to them and an understanding about how those things are impacted by the environments in which people live. So I won't get too much into this, but basically we put this up because right now in the United States we're into a kind of an argument about how important outcomes and clinical effectiveness are to the whole issue about genetic testing and in precision medicine. Because right now part of the problem is the push is to take all the money and to put it into basic research. Not that I don't believe in basic research, but I do believe strongly in the fact that there's another part of the continuum that is very important to inform this. So that's it. I hope I didn't go too fast in my English. I get a little hypomanic at times, but I like that condition, so I don't go for treatment for it. And if you want to find out more information, you can go to PCORI.org. And if you just want to ask me a question, that's my email. I don't do texting. Please don't text me. It costs me 20 cents every time you do that. So I won't like that, but I will certainly take emails anytime you want to, and I will respond, actually, to your email. So thank you, and I think it's now time for the commentaries, and then we can take questions. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Norquist. So now I'm pleased to invite the three discussants to join me here. No. Okay, please have a seat. Well, so after this excellent presentation of Professor Norquist, we have now the intervention of the three discussants. I will start asking Professor Vaz Carneiro, would you like to start with your comment, please?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I would like to thank Professor Caldas de Almeida by the kind invitation to be here. And I'd like to say, Professor Norquist, I really enjoy your talk. I'm very envious of you. I really do. I had at the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine, in which you do some of this work, but of course, when you're talking about funding, this is a quite different thing. So it's very interesting when I look at these things. And I'm a clinician, I'm an internist, and so I kind of, what I'm really worried about is doing actually clinical research. And when we look at the continuum of research, of health research, what we see is that we normally start on genome, cells, lines, then we go to animal models, then we go into more clinical patient-based research, then you go to epidemiology, and in so doing, we kind of tend to believe that we are doing two different things. One thing is to study the fundamental workings of the biological systems, and the other one is looking at epidemiological research. What this thing brings on is very interesting, because we go from the basic research into clinical research and then to epidemiological, but this then goes back to the individual patient, which is really new, in the sense that we use all this data to be able to say, is this person going to respond to my treatment the way it's supposed to respond? Now, in order to answer this, of course, but clinical trials, of course, the samples may be quite different from my patient, and they are. Most of the time, my patient is much sicker than the person that they studied. It's easy to see that normally the patient I see have about 5 different diseases or risk factors, and these patients are not studied in clinical trials, period. And so we are left with some, knowledge of disease, knowledge of the patient, and also knowledge of interventions, and make some sense about it and do the best we can. And what this really brings us is a completely new landscape. This is brand new, and I think it's really, really, really interesting. Because now, hopefully, we will be able to look at the real life. This is also a way of looking at what we do every day. And of course, the examples you gave me are perfectly typical. Sometimes what I think is a success for me and my patient does not think at all it's a success. I'm convinced that the things went well, but he doesn't think this way. because he's suffering, he's having a lot of pain. But I say, well, but you're cured. No, not really. I mean, this is not the way I want to live. And so this can really help us by grasping the complexity of different subgroups of patients inside the huge community that we are supposed to treat. And you really show that very well. One of the biggest things here is certainly look and ask the patients, what do you want us to do? And when you ask that, we get some differences of what we really think is important, again, what they think is important. And that is really very, very centered because we are trying to apply a huge amount of knowledge into specific patients. And it's also a new paradigm, I think, because once you want to look at the biological phenomena, what you're trying to establish here is causality. Does this thing works? Does this test the diagnosis? Does this prognostic factor actually prognose anything? Can foresee anything? With big data like this, we are not looking at causality anymore. We are looking at correlations. We don't really know why, sometimes we don't really know why these characteristics of patients in this huge database will respond better to the treatment. But we do know that in so doing, we can almost predict a little bit of the future. And I'd like to hear your opinion about this. We are switching from causality into correlations, and in so doing, we may predict who's going to answer better to the treatment, or if there is any specific thing that these people have that the others don't. And so I look at this as a natural evolution of clinical research. I was expecting this for many time, the way that we are, actually augmenting our knowledge about a lot of ways that we do things. This health services research, this health outcomes research is really, really crucial. But just to finish, there's one area that I think is even clinically more significant and more relevant, which is clinical effectiveness research. And that is a huge problem. If you look at breast cancer, for example, and you look at, let's say, localized breast cancer, if you look at the array of treatments that one have, you may not decide to do anything, just expect to see what's going to happen. You may decide to do a lumpectomy. You may decide to do a mastectomy. You may decide to use chemotherapy, biological therapy, radiation therapy, but you really don't know if any combinations of this are going to do better for your patient or not. One of the most common cancers, we don't have that information. And the only way we're going to have this information, I really think so, is using this methodology that PCORI uses. I don't think there's any other way that you're going to get this answer. And if I go out from cancer, for example, into cardiovascular medicine, for example, people that have hypertension, but also diabetes, and also have a stroke, and also have peptic ulcer, these really complex things. So we are always trying to put patients in subgroups of risk, and this comforts me as a clinician that I'm better funded to do that than I used to do until now. And I think this is a major issue for the future, even for managing healthcare. If you get this information, you can have a much better management of healthcare. By identifying high responder subgroups from non-responders, you may have a huge advantage. Take, for example, every treatment that you give to a patient has benefits and risks. Now, I know that, for example, tell me if I'm right, on the practical standpoint of view, on everyday clinical practice, only 50% of people with depression actually responds as well as clinical trials. On cancer, it's only 1 out of 4. Only 1 out of 4 patients will respond as well as the people that were studied with the same cancer in clinical trials. Now, given the fact that all the interventions have benefits and risks, if they don't get the benefit, then they will only get the risk. I'm not talking about your money right now. I'm just saying, how am I going to identify not the responders, but the non-responders? And I really, truly, this is a methodology. So thank you very much for your talk. It was really interesting. And I hope that I can have the chance to listen to you again. And please say hello to Jim for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Vaz Carneiro. So now I will give the floor to Professor Altamiro.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Caldas de Almeida for the kind invitation to participate in this meeting, and it is really a pleasure to come here, especially to hear such a high-quality conference, which raised, I think, the awareness of everyone in the room about the importance and complementarity of this type of research. The first, Professor Caldas de Almeida, when he invited us, he asked us to comment on your talk, especially regarding the lessons learned from the PCORI and somehow to be applied to the Portuguese reality. So I must somehow try to address this in a way. So first of all, as a background, I've been a medical doctor and I graduated medicine, and I have done in the beginning pediatrics. It is interesting because when, as a medical student, I thought, as most medical students still think today, that there is nothing to be discovered more in medicine. Everything is in the textbooks. Everything is clear. Everything is perfect. And you just need to study it. And of course, when I started as a medical resident in pediatrics, then I got into reality. And I could not understand why some of my colleagues would prescribe this type of antibiotics or this type of drug, while some others in what it seems to me exactly the same condition would prescribe or do things totally different. And then I have tried to come up with evidence, and it was extremely hard to do it. So eventually I moved somehow from practical medicine to epidemiology and to public health. And I thought, well, maybe we don't know exactly what to do to a particular patient, but maybe we do know, or we should know what to do in the populations or in the average patient and so on. So I took a PhD in epidemiology and public health in the United Kingdom. And then I came back, and then I realized that we were missing all the tools really to face in an efficient way this kind of problems. So I started to teach biostatistics, which were not taught before in my own faculty. And then, of course, I realized that this was not enough because we did not have medical registries whatsoever at that time. So I have started also to teach medical informatics. And then, of course, so we have teaching to medical students, and we have started also a master in medical informatics, which is now, well, started more than 10 years ago, and is almost everyone that is doing now informatics in the hospital, somehow they have passed there, and I think this have helped somehow. Well, then I realized that this was not enough, not at all. So I started doing teaching research methodology, and we have started a program. First, also a master program in evidence and decision in health. And then we moved on to a doctoral program in clinical and health services research, which is now in this 7th edition. And well, I was looking yesterday to some outcomes, and I realized that our PhD students, as first author, they have already produced something like 70 peer-reviewed papers in impact factor journals, and the average of the journals is about 3.8, which is not so bad. And they come from many different faculties, not only from Porto. We have students from Lisbon, that have been trained in Lisbon, in Coimbra, all over the country, basically. And also, they are in many different hospitals. But I realized that this was not enough, because it was missing a research kind of center, because the main research centers in Portugal, and they have started more than 20 years ago, were biomedical in basic sciences. And of course, as you told, I have nothing against basic sciences, but I am very pro the more the sciences in the upper part of the spectrum. And well, in Lisbon, you have mainly the EMM at Faculty of Medicine, and also the Gulbenkian Institute. So very strong basic research groups. In Coimbra, they have IBLI, and in Porto, they have now I3S. But no one really was, well, there were some research centers focusing more on clinical, but very minuscule, and not founded almost at all. So we have started a research center in health, in technologies and health services. Of course, trying all the time to link all these different matters, so to link biostatistics, to link medical informatics or medical registries, to link clinical research, and all this. And now, and also to incorporate other stakeholders, not only medical doctors, but also nurses, also psychologists, also nutritionists, and so on. So, and now our research unit has around 120 PhDs. And the other thing that we have tried to do was not to center it in my own faculty, but to have a national-wide so to address somehow these kind of problems wherever the researchers would be. And that's why, for instance, Professor Vaz Carneiro is one of our researchers, and we have researchers also in the University of Algarve, and of course most of them still are in Porto. So but of course we still have, this is not still enough, not at all. I have recently, the government for the first time started really to look at to these problems in an adequate way, in the sense, in a way. In America, people always, and I think that's a good thing that sometimes is badly understood, but I think it's basically a good thing, is they ask all the time, where is the money? Where the money goes, where the money... Because this shows really what is the interest of things, and so on and so. And for the first time, the government approved a package, well, for the moment is still not being implemented, but is still an idea, where some money will really be put, some significant money, for Portugal at least. Of course, it's almost the money of a single grant in the States, but for Portugal is quite good. Money will be put into this type of research, clinical research and patient outcome research. We have actually had a project that was approved between us, the University of Lisbon, and Harvard, with the Harvard medical program together with Portugal, and this project is actually on comparative effectiveness research in cardiovascular disease, and is comparing interventions in Portugal with interventions in Boston and Massachusetts area, which is more or less the same amount of population, and we have some common data sets like the DRGs that we are looking at. To set up this project have been quite a challenge. Firstly, to be approved, we were candidate 3 times, and at first time it was not even evaluated. This was considered, I think, so terrible project that did not even come to the second stage of the evaluation. The second time also for an administrative problem that I don't know what it was, but was not also evaluated. And for the first time, so it was already in the last part of the program, and I thought, well, this was be impossible. Then I don't know what happened, but some people said, "Oh, this is a very good project," and we were financed. But then the troubles continued because we could not get easily access to data sets. The data sets had a very low quality of the data, and one of the reasons, of course, is that because nobody have looked into it before, and if you don't look to something, well, this does not have so much quality, and so on and so forth. So the only thing I could say is that I'll be begging to Professor Caldas de Almeida that would address our science health secretary of science and education, that unfortunately cannot be here, to tell her how much we welcome and how much we need the type of initiative that now the government, in conjunction the two ministries, the Ministry of Science and Education and the Ministry of Health, are now trying to put forward. I think this or can be really terrible, well, very good news, and maybe this is still not what is needed really to do this type of research in a strong way, because we still need, of course, to be able to link data sets to improve the quality of the registers. We still need many methodological things in order that we can really do this type of research in high quality. But if the government and the responsibles will listen to talks such as yours and the points that you have made, I enjoyed many things, of course, because are the things that I've been talking for a few years without little audience apart from my own students and my own people in the department. But I think things like the independence and the founding of these $2 per insurance, and which is a different thing, but a similar thing that is happening now, for instance, with Infarmed, that also have some independent founding coming from the pharmaceutical industry. So if these lessons will really be taken by Portuguese authorities, then with due time, with a lot of patience, with a lot of work, because one needs. You said that it takes, and it's true that it takes around almost 20 years for a new technology to be fully uptake and known by. But I would say it also takes about 20 years to train people. Pita Barros, I've been with him in Lisbon about 20 years ago, in the beginning of the Association of Health Economics. Then I would say that it still needs much health economics, but is doing a wonderful job. But what I think it really needs time and a proper awareness and a proper governance in order that all these links will be put together and be able really to do quality and integrated research as you are doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Altamiro. And now we move to the last comment. Pedro, please.
Okay, so first of all, I make mine all the official greetings of the previous commentators, save some time. As you can see by people leaving, I'm an economist by training, so I look on this as an economist. So I do not see patients. I do not run a health insurance. I do not manage healthcare organizations. So I will be a patient in your stakeholder list, or probably health system researcher, probably some of these things. So
As they study no cost, you have no job.
exactly. So, okay, good. Well, first of all, I will mix several comments and questions and clarification issues that I would like to hear you on. First is a comment, is that what you call comparative clinical effectiveness research is actually something in Europe we call economic evaluation, because we put the cost in there. And so it's basically the same thing, so for most people will not make much of a difference. Now, the question that you raised, the broad question, is that we do not have enough evidence. And so in a sense, the true question is where to get it, what is the best organization to provide it. And a question that was appearing in my mind when we were talking is, what are the difference between a large country and a small country in setting up this evidence? How much can we gain from just free riding on the US, what the US are doing with the PCORI, and how much do we need to have our own PCORI around here? Just to give an idea, if you just apply the same procedure of having €2 and not $2 per person that is insured in Portugal with the National Health Service, that means 20 million euros, which will not bring us very far. And yeah, but still, if you want to put them, yeah, but then you're putting the a heavier load on the population here. So that's one thing. Another thing is that now you have. You said that you become an independent institution because there are two already, and they didn't want to put this job into any of the other two. So, and that institutional building can actually take some time and can create problems between the three institutions over time. So my question is, do you find any jealousy from the NHI, for example? Do you have any evidence? Because that would mean that you have doing a better job than they do, right? And so do you have any evidence that you are actually provoking any reaction from them? Another issue, there are a couple of sentences that you said that are quite challenging. Say, one of them was make research relevant to end users. And the question is, who defines exactly what that is? And it would be nice to know a little bit more of how do you make that appraisal? How do you make sure that happens? And how do you avoid it to be captured by researchers and by medical professionals, whatever? How do we avoid this capture of people saying what the end users want is? Would be the typical way of saying it. One thing that you didn't mention at all, and that's or I missed it in the words that I like to use for it, is that we can have economic incentives even if you don't have costs in built. And one of the things that was surprising me all over, it was to say, okay, we're providing this information, but it doesn't mean that people will have an incentive to use it or are going to use it for different things. For example, one thing that you put it there with a high mark was prevention. But prevention has cost now and benefits in the future. Maybe a huge time lapse between the two. So they have a time profile issue. And so why are going people to use information that you may give them on prevention if they don't have the payment tools, the financial tools, to actually get the gain from that from the future to now? And I wonder whether such integration with payment systems would actually be useful and should be part of the research programs. See, as an economist, I'm always trying to get the market for my own. That's basically the point. Also said something that actually I think it's quite important. Patients want a life. I think that's one marking sentence. But probably each patient for the same problem wants a different life. And probably see that in your patients that you see. And so the question is how to deal with that heterogeneity in patients and to make it enter research. Because then in research you actually want to be slightly more homogeneous so that you can take statistical inference from what you're seeing, but then the heterogeneity in practice will destroy that evidence that you are trying to gather. So it seems to be kind of, needs to be a way out of this, right? How to learn and make inference for something that you want to be heterogeneous, but at the same time you want to have some idea of what goes on that. From the economic point of view, there is also an important difference between what is observable, say patients and doctors may observe, and what is verifiable. Because verifiable requires something more, requires that an external observer can actually look into it and decide something. So if you're taking me as your patient and you decide to prescribe something for me, we could both observe and have a shared decision, as you said. But if somehow I said, you took the wrong decision, and I should not pay for what you prescribed me, I will need someone else to come in and verify what that is. And I wonder whether that comes into your in the way of thinking about the projects, whether it's not only that becomes observable, but it's also verifiable in the sense that can be used as a payment systems and so on, which in the US will mean that could be taken to court, for example. I think that will be something that I like to know. One thing, well, I understand when you say healthcare required to achieve best outcomes in each population that was there. I understand the point of it, and I understand that you cannot put the costs, so can only look on the benefits. But ignoring the cost may also ignore some trade-offs that you want to make during the research itself. So I wonder how optimizing under constraints can be different from optimizing without constraints, and just looking on the benefits without looking on the constraints that you may face, whether or not just not takes you to a different road than if you were including actually the costs. My guess is that probably people will implicitly use cost notions somehow, but they cannot just say it. But I wonder whether it's true or not. Because if you are proposing an intervention that nobody will be able to afford, there's no point in doing it, right? So I wonder how this will go actually into it. Broad question. Are you reviewing not only new interventions, but also current practice? It seemed to me that that was the case. I think that would be an important issue to clarify. Also talked a little bit about speed of implementation. Actually, I would be curious about what are the main barriers to this speed of implementation that you're mentioning. From the presentation, it seemed that will be only information and evidence. And just by providing information and evidence, you can accelerate implementation. I wonder whether that's all. And if you have more, I'd like to hear more on that part of the talk. And then, what are the small countries' lessons? Not just what you gain from the US, but what will be your advice for a small country? And that's about it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, all the discussants. There are many questions and challenges for discussion. So, Gray, would you like to comment? Of course,
Yeah.
you don't have to try to respond to all the questions, but the ones that seems at least...
I mean, these are excellent questions. And let me just say that I also have done health economics, and I sponsored the health economics program when I was at the NIMH. So I have great interest in that, and it is a constraint that we do not adhere to. I mean, let me just say that we do not publicly we do not fund studies that are, quote, cost effectiveness studies, but embedded in some of our studies are obviously the implications of the cost of the medications and things like that. Right, so it's there, and it will be used in other kinds of ways. And you're absolutely right earlier on that we're not arguing that comparative effectiveness research is some new concept. It's the way in which we're approaching it and who we're using as the end user. So I would agree with you, So all of what you say, some of these big, and I won't go through each one because I can't remember all of them, so I'd have to go, as a whole other intervention, yeah. But we could talk about, every one of those has come up as an issue, and part of the way that we're addressing this is in methodological ways. We actually have people who are actually addressing some of the very questions. What is the validity of what is being said, the heterogeneity of what is a response that people want, which is why you need large populations, because ultimately there will be homogeneous groups, if you have a large enough, who will agree on what the outcomes are that they may want. And there are some outcomes that we could argue that are not, that may have to be based on a variety of opinions on that one patient's decision about it. I mean, in mental health, there's sometimes, I mean, look, if you have dementia, major neurocognitive disorder, you may not have an understanding of what's going on. It may have to be based on what a caregiver or somebody else thinks is the highest level of what they want. So it's a good question, and one that's not easily answered, but one that I would say that we're struggling with and actually trying to find answers to that. So usually what happens when I was at NIH, you would say, that's an interesting question, don't know, somebody maybe will figure that out, we're just going to go ahead and do this study, So what I would say is our approach to it is to address it head on. And so many of the questions that I was resonating, because I've heard these same things before, and we have a number of folks who actually are trying to focus on how do we address some of these very difficult issues that you're talking about. It's complex. It's not easy, right?
Well, we still have room for a couple of questions from the audience. Sergio, please.
One thing that it's not clear for me is CORI, through research, produces information and recommendations. So, for instance, if through research they found out that procedure A is better than procedure B, this recommendation should be implemented throughout US or must be implemented throughout US?
So we do not, we are not a federal agency, and we do not mandate what should be done. So we don't produce treatment guidelines. That almost put one of our federal agencies out of business at one point when they came up with some treatment guidelines for back pain and angered the orthopedic surgeons, and they almost put them out of business. So we just say, here's the evidence, and we allow the others, like our Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, which actually is the one, and the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and others can take that information and try to say this is something that should be done. What we're about is just providing the facts about what is likely the better of 2 or 3 or whatever interventions, and then what others in our federal government or others decide to do to try to make that happen will be up to them. And that's where the cost issue comes in. We fully recognize that someone else will take that information, match the cost to it, like we're doing with the hepatitis C, because we pretty well know what those costs are, and that was one of the main reasons that drove that study, was because of the outrageous cost of some of these medications. And at the end of the day, when the findings of that come out, then other agencies will take that information and then use it from a policy decision, but we don't cross the line on the policy or we'll be out of business, to be honest. So there are the political issues we do have to face, even though we are not a federal agency, but we could still lose our money, and we would be out of business at that point. So.
Any other question or comment from the audience? Yes, please.
Okay, I was touched by your presentation, really. I believe that in this coming century, observational studies will have much huger place. First point. Second point, you have been touching classic issues like the fibrotic uterus. And we know, for example, from the literature, that more than 30% of women did not improve her health care or even got worse from immediate surgical problems or after depression or whatever. So I want to ask you how far patients' choices are considered in your, let's say, criteria to elect studies.
So that's a key component. I mean, the key component is what is it that patients want at the end of for an outcome, basically drives what the intervention may be in order to achieve that particular outcome. But patients are front and center of everything that we do, and what is it that they want at the end of that is really key. So I think when we designed that particular study, we had a group of women actually with uterine fibroids, their clinicians who take care of them and stuff, who came to the table together and said, here's what the interventions are, what is it that we want at the end of the day as an outcome for this intervention, and what are the ones that we know right now, and what are the potential outcomes of those interventions. So I would say they were front and center for that.
Can I ask a quick question? Can you look at the variation in care? In other words,
yes.
Is that an important issue?
Yeah, so that's a key issue, yeah. And the variation, I mean, in the United States, actually, it's quite variable. You know, I mean, you can go to different towns and stuff, and what they do for back pain just varies tremendously. Basically because there's not good evidence about what to do, so you'll get a surgical group in Washington, D.C. who does a lot of surgery, and you'll get another group who won't touch people with surgery, you know.
When you get good evidence, still there's a lot of evidence.
There's still, well, because the cost, again, because you make a lot of money if you do surgery, you know, in the United States, so they still argue it should be done until you can convince them that it's not. And usually that's where the policymakers get in, and the policymakers say, if you want to do it, fine, but you're going to pay for it out of your pocket. We are not going to fund this. The health insurers are not going to fund it. The federal government in our Medicare plan is not going to fund it. And that's what usually happens, is basically we have evidence not to do this. If you want to do it, if you want to have cosmetic surgery, go have it, but we're not paying for it, you know.
Yes, Rui, please. Oh, after you.
Thank you for your great presentation. It was really a pleasure to hear you. I have a question regarding methodology in patient-centered outcomes research. What you talked to us about, well, really from the methodological point of view, you can approach it with several tools, several important different types of studies. I would say that probably I have seen that some of the things you do is, for example, in the research synthesis. So, for example, network meta-analysis and things like that. Also in primary data, cohort studies, the observational studies that were just said that are so important in this kind of research. Certainly, you do also talked us about pragmatic trials, one of the huge relevant methodological pathways in this kind of research as well. You can actually do some of this work in actual trials, the usual phase 3 trials that we already have. So my question is, what are your priorities? What do you think is the most important tools? You certainly are going to tell me that you use every one of them, but which ones are those that you are funding the most? Which one are those that you think are more important? And for Portugal, for example, where should we put our money? In synthesis, research synthesis? Should we put it in observational studies? Should we put it in pragmatic trials? Should we put it in generating databases from the real world that allow us to really do this with real world data? What do you think is the best way to go for a country like Portugal? Thank you.
So I'll give you the political answer that we would always say in the United States, which is you do it the way that will give you the outcome that you want, right? So doesn't that sound like a good politician? The reality is I don't know what you want because I haven't asked your folks exactly what. I mean, you know, we would argue we would use the same methodology we use here, which is to ask what is it that the Portuguese people think they need most. And that gets back to the issue about what you're saying is where would, if Portugal had $20 million, you had $40 million, or you had let's make it big, let's say $100 million suddenly that you got, where would you put it? And that's for you to decide what is the most important. You could piggyback. Why wouldn't you? I mean, look, if you came up with a great study on uterine fibroids and you answered the question about what the intervention was for uterine fibroids, why would I pay for that, right? Because your women have the same uterine fibroids as our, you know, there may be differences in the way you treat, but why wouldn't I take that? And I think one of the issues is why we're so interested in the global opportunities is we would love to, you know, parcel out what the big questions are among us and come to all of these things. Why should any one place be responsible for answering all of the questions? We in the United States, for example, from an economic point of view, we argue that we support all of the drugs from around the world because we pay the highest prices for them. And the drug companies quite honestly say, yes, we charge you more, and then you guys have a better opportunity with your governments to lower the prices. We still pay very high. So, but I would argue that it is an opportunity and that we should think about. It shouldn't be, it's an opportunity that more of a discussion among a variety of different places about what are the big questions and how could we collaborate to answer these questions. Now for methodologies, I'm also going to beg off because I'm not a big methodologist, right? And we have a whole methodology group that are experts at this. And if you look at our website, there is a wonderful methodology report. And I would encourage you, since you're very interested in that, to read it. And if you have concerns about that, please respond to that because we're always asking people to respond. But it outlines in detail, and you didn't even mention Bayesian because everybody always talks about the Bayesian method. So, I mean, that's one that I know a lot about. But it's outlined in there, and they try to give specific examples of where something is much more of an important methodology to answer a specific question. So I would push you toward that because I wouldn't even dream of trying to answer which one is better than the other. And what my methodologists would always say to me is, well, the one that answers the question, that's the one you do correctly, right? Okay.
Rui, please. Just two brief questions. One concerns it's a bit a definition issue of clinical research. And from your description, of course the Institute is very much centered on this part of the clinical research, which is patient-centered outcomes. And that is only part of the spectrum of clinical research, because before that there is a lot of research done on patients, on cohorts of patients, to define subgroups by, say, genetic, immunological, biochemical methods, and all that is part of the chain that allows the generation of a specific intervention. And that is clinical research. Do you value less that part of research? The Institute also is involved on that, those components, because there is always the risk of excluding that which is part of the chain of generation of knowledge up to the hand of the application. That's one question. And the second one is a bit related to that one, which concerns the, it's very interesting, all these emphasis on patient involvement in the process of assessment and following the discovery, the applications, and also all the other stakeholders. That's very interesting. I think it's a very strong message that I got from your presentation. But do you see any side effects of getting too, say, dominated by that word of the patient and patient associations, in terms of just imagining that perhaps 1 out of 10 big breakthroughs in the past 30 years probably, in my view, would not have been selected for the research?
So let me answer the first question, which is, and what we would answer, and it's all relative, you know, it's how much money is big money. So, you know, $50 million in my bank account would be a lot of money. So, so we only have $500 or $600 million a year. The National Institutes of Health in the United States has over $8 billion a year. And so most of the phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trial work is done by the National Institutes of Health. What they have not done well, I mean, I was there for 15 years, and what everyone would argue is that the reason that we are doing it is they have not done a good job. And I think someone asked this question earlier about that, is there jealousy? Well, we contain some of the jealousy because the director of the NIH is on our board, but yes, of course, he would love to have another $500 million. I don't think there's any question about that. But the reality is the reason that we got set up as an independent group is because it was not being done well. And I don't think Francis would say, if he were sitting here, yes, he sees the NIH now as the Health Discovery Institute. Basically, I mean, that's what they're about, is discovering the new interventions, doing this legwork and stuff. Our job is to then look at how well those things work in practical world, right? And so that's where the National Institutes has not done well, has not gotten into it. And I'll be honest with you, when I was there, part of the reason they didn't is it gets too political sometimes, and they get very worried about that. They saw what has happened when somebody says, well, this is not better than that. They don't want to get into that. And so that's why we got funded to do it. Now, are we going to be too patient-centered? I don't know. I think patients would say you can never be too patient-centered. The reality is that patients are not our only stakeholder. Clinicians, like myself, are stakeholders. We want systems of care need to know, the people who fund the health need to know, health insurance they need to know, and caretakers, actually. So if you look at children, it's not usually, sometimes children make the decisions, but often it's the family or their caretakers. And then I'm a geriatric psychiatrist, and people who end up with major neurocognitive disorder, they're not making the decisions, it's their caretakers. So a lot depends on the compilation of the various stakeholders that are involved at the end. But at the end of the day, and just think about yourself, if you ever have to go for medical care, it's ultimately you that's going to make the decision if you've still got your cognitive awareness about what matters to you and what you really want. And I think that part of the problem we've had in health is that we've always focused on what we thought was the right thing to do and what the intervention is we believe. So as I said, for the example, in prostate cancer, and in cancer, the idea is wipe out cancer, just get rid of it. But the reality is the treatments that we use in cancer are quite toxic. I mean, basically chemotherapeutic agents are poison. And the way we use those is basically to knock it out. But if you ask most cancer patients, if you say to them, and there are many interventions in cancer, you get maybe a 2 or 3 month survival. And we spend lots of money on that. Is that really what you want? And there are a lot of patients who come in and say, you know, if I knew it was only a 5% chance for 3 months, give me half that money and I'll go on a cruise. I mean, you know, is that a legitimate intervention? I don't know. But I agree, there has been, I will tell you, that we have gotten some pushback, quite honestly, about concern about, is patient-centered really better than what we had before? And we shall see. I mean, it is an experiment in and of itself, and we shall see if the payoff is better.
Well, we can see that we could go on in this discussion, that the conference of Professor Norquist raised a lot of interest and questions. And in my perspective, and the perspective of the Lisbon Society of Medical Sciences, we are very happy because I think the main objectives of these sessions were completely attained, because what we wanted was first to put outcomes research among the discussion of health sciences in Portugal, what has not been the case. Also to listen from someone who has experience in a successful and ambitious project in another country, not hoping to have recommendations that would solve all our problems, but mostly to help us to see which are the main questions, and that all of us leaving this room will have a couple of things that we may think in a different way when we arrive today. And I think the important thing for me is that the conference of Professor Norquist showed us that this part of the research on what really works in the real world is a very important part of the health research, and that the example of the US in putting money on this is a good example for us. How we are getting to get that money, that is our problem. But we can see that when we are creative, like in the US, the PCORI, we can find solutions that maybe in the beginning you didn't know that you could get $2 from each insurance premium. That's maybe not the solution for us, but it can inspire us and give other solutions. I think there are several strong messages that I will try to convey to the Secretary of State. The first, the importance of outcome research, of course, the importance of engaging, involving the patients. It's not something we are used to do. The importance of large numbers, the importance, as it was already stated, of observational studies, and also I think we have also a good example of working together with the Congress, together people from different branches of medicine, and people from many different universities. I think PCORI in that sense is a very good example for us. And we had also the opportunity to see that in Portugal we have done more than maybe we were convinced. We could see that there are people who have done a very good job, a lot of work in the past, people who are very well prepared to discuss this issue. So we have the basics. Now it's a question of convincing the policymakers that we need more support to this type of research. So thank you very much, Gray, first of all, for your conference. Thank you, Professor Vaz Carneiro, Professor Altamiro, Pedro Pita Barros, for your comments. And thank you, all of you, for having come to this session, and for your attention, your comments. Maybe one day in 5 or 10 years, when there will be some decisions to put a lot of money on outcomes research, we can say, well, that session in Gulbenkian was the start of this big success. If it is true, I will send you a note. As by the way, you know, to end in a positive note, the project we worked in 15 years ago, you remember that grant of NIMH for Latin America, it was quite successful, not in the way we had expected. But nowadays, many of the young people who participated in that program, now they are doing excellent research and publish a lot. Was only the effect of the program? Certainly not. But there was some contribution. So maybe one day we'll... Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, all of you.